Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ronald White, and I'm the Dean of the University of Baltimore School of Law. I'm very pleased and proud tonight to welcome you to the 25th Annual Stead Lecture on International Law, sponsored by our Center on International and Comparative Law and some other partners whom I will name shortly. Let me begin by commending all of you for joining us on this important occasion. I know we have many students at the University of Baltimore with us, and I believe some outsiders as well, for the opportunity to hear a very distinguished human rights lawyer, Gay McDougall, who will be introduced shortly. And Dr. McDougall is going to be discussing a very important subject, the international ramifications of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. So this will be a fascinating discussion, and I think you'll all be very pleased that you spent this time with us. This lecture is sponsored, as I said, by the University of Baltimore School of Law's Center on International and Comparative Law, directed by Professor Mortimer Tim Sellers and Deputy Director Ninke Grossman, both of whom you will hear from shortly. The event is co-sponsored by the American Society of International Law's Women in International Law Interest Group, the Blacks at the International Society of International Law Interest Group, and the Minorities in International Law Interest Group. We are, in fact, our law school is an academic partner of the American Society of International Law. So all of these entities have come together to present this lecture to you, and I'm very proud that we're the venue for this important talk. Let me now introduce my colleague, Professor Tim Sellers. Tim is director of our Center on International and Comparative Law, and he is as well the University System of Maryland Regents Professor of Law at our school, and currently holds the Wilson Elkins Professorship, a prestigious professorship awarded by the University System of Maryland. Tim is the longtime director of the center and a professor at our school, and can tell us more about the Stead Lecture. Tim, please join us.
Thank you very much, Dean Weish. As the Dean has said, I'm Tim Sellers, co-director with Professor Ninke Grossman of the Center for International and Comparative Law. And I am deeply honored to be able to welcome you all to the 25th Annual John Stead Lecture in International and Comparative Law. My colleague, Ninke Grossman, will introduce our wonderful speaker in a minute. But I want to begin by saying something about the lecture and about Dr. John Sumner Stead. Dr. Stead was a British physician who served in the British Navy during the Second World War and was deeply committed to the Atlantic Alliance and to the values of reason, humanity, human rights, and the self-determination of peoples that are at the heart of international law and that are at the heart of the United Nations system, championed by the United States and Great Britain and the victorious allies after the Second World War. It is appropriate that the very first Stead lecturer, Conrad Harper, who was then the legal advisor to the United States Department of State, spoke about the law of nations and a nation of laws, which was then and should always be the mission of the United States in the world. Today, we live in a world where the government of the United States has, in the past 4 years, violated treaties, violated universal human rights, and the President of the United States has pardoned convicted war criminals. So we live in a very different world than we did in 1945 or even in 1996 when the first of these lectures was given. But one thing that has not changed is that the United States continues to produce some of the best and most dedicated scholars of international law in the world, among them today's very distinguished speaker, and also my highly respected and admired colleague, Ninke Grossman. Ninke Grossman is one of the great lights of international law today. She is a leader in the American Society of International Law, and therefore, we're fortunate that she is the one, well, first of all, and she is my co-director, which makes me a fortunate person. So Professor Grossman will now introduce today's speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Sellers and Dean Weish, for all of your support for the Center and for International Law at the University of Baltimore. I also want to thank President Schmoke, who's joining us today and is also here on the Zoom. So I'm truly honored and humbled to introduce to you our speaker for this evening, Professor Gay McDougall, to deliver remarks titled, Cries of Black Lives Matter Reverberate Worldwide, Even the UN Quakes. Generations of Black Americans throughout US history have suffered violations of their civil and human rights, including the most basic rights to life and to be free from torture. And generations have marched and litigated and protested and fought for the realization of the full panoply of rights that the US Constitution and international human rights law require. As two Black Lives Matter activists wrote in Time magazine on International Human Rights Day in 2015, quote, "We recognize the current struggle is not merely for reforms of policing, any more than the Montgomery bus boycott was simply about a seat on the bus. It is about the full recognition of our rights as citizens, and it is a battle for full civil, social, political, legal, economic, and cultural rights as enshrined in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights." But how has the world community responded to these protests, and what role does it have to play? We could ask for no better speaker on these issues than Gay McDougall. Professor McDougall has spent her professional life fighting for equality for people of all races and genders and for economic justice. Professor McDougall has been a leader on human rights within the UN for over 30 years, serving in various capacities, including as the first UN independent expert on minority issues, as vice chair of the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and as special rapporteur on the issue of systematic rape and sexual slavery in armed conflict. She also played a leadership role in the UN Third World Conference Against Racism. Professor McDougall was a member of the South African government body that administered South Africa's first democratic non-racial elections in 1994, which resulted in the election of President Nelson Mandela and the downfall of apartheid. She also served for 15 years as the director of the Southern African Project of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, and for 15 years as executive director of Global Rights, a human rights group that worked with activists in 10 countries. She is the recipient of numerous awards and honorary degrees, including the MacArthur Genius Award. I have to say it's the first time I've introduced a genius, and it's a little intimidating. And she's also a winner of the Butcher Medal of the American Society of International Law for outstanding contributions to human rights law, and the Thurgood Marshall Lifetime Achievement Award from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She's currently a distinguished scholar in residence at the Leitner Center on International Law and Justice and the Center on Race, Law, and Justice at Fordham University Law School. I know you are all clapping from home as you join me in welcoming her to the University of Baltimore. And I will now give the floor to Professor McDougall to deliver her remarks, which will be followed by some time for Q&A. So I request that you refrain from using the chat in the meantime. And please be aware that whatever you put in the chat will not be private. So please remember that before you type anything. Thank you very much. And with that, we're very excited to hear from Professor Gay McDougall.
And before Professor McDougall begins, I missed one of my tasks, which was to encourage participants to use the speaker view. I think you all have been on Zoom enough to know in the upper right-hand corner, if you press the view and then you can choose speaker view, and this way you can concentrate on our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Well, Thank you all. I'm really quite excited to be here. It's my first visit to Baltimore, University of Baltimore Law School. I want to thank the co-sponsors, very incredible group of people. It's not enough to name the groups, the Basel and the minority International Law Interest Group and Women's International Law Interest Group. It's not enough just to name the organizations, but I must say I know many of you personally, and I know the careers that you have had over the years, and I'm quite honored that you have asked me to speak this evening. I also want to thank the University of Baltimore Law School, particularly Ninka Grossman, for hosting this event. So welcome to my home office. You know, I have been driven most of my life and career by the power of ideas. You know, ideas sometimes very simple in their own way, but undeniable, like the term Black Lives Matter. But these seemingly simple words and ideas can change the entire world order. And again, it's been something that has driven my life and career constantly. I'm going to try to turn on a video here.
Please, the knee in my neck. I can't breathe.
Bro, get up, get in the car, man.
I will.
Get up, get in the car.
I can't move.
I've been waiting the whole thing, man. Get up, get in the car.
Mama.
Get up and get in the car right.
I can't.
You can't get y'all the opportunity to get in, bro. I told you can't win.
My knee.
You can't
my neck.
win, man.
I'm through.
I know you is now because you didn't listen.
When the protests erupted on May 26th in response to the police murder of George Floyd, it was only one of a string of killings of unarmed Black men and women by police and armed vigilantes. A string of killings that extend back to 1619, when the first enslaved African was brought to these shores. Killings that started from when the first slave said no, through the constant runaways of collective revolts, through the emancipation period, through the era of the Black Codes, the night raids of the Klan and Jim Crow lynchings, through the Civil Rights era, through the murders of Black Power leaders, through the period of so-called non-racialism, through to, well, through to yesterday, when the police in Philadelphia killed Walter Wallace. Was this time different? I can't tell you how many times I've been asked that question. Well, it certainly has been different in that we have far more allies. This callous killing of Floyd was witnessed by communities across the US and across the world, and it shocked the conscience of the world in ways that, you know, only seeing those minutes could have. And so people immediately piled out into the streets to cry and to protest and to demonstrate. And we were joined by people who demonstrated in over 50 countries around the world. And, you know, to be honest, in many countries, those, you know, demonstrations were demonstrations of solidarity because they were very familiar with police killings and security force beatings that occur routinely in their own countries from police who attack dissidents and demonstrators, as I say, routine. Was this different? Well, it was different from past times because this time Trump was president. The violent police responses to largely peaceful protests included the use of rubber bullets, tear gas, pepper spray, and in some cases live ammunition, in violation of international standards on the use of force and the management of assemblies and protests and demonstrations. Rather than using his position as president and leader of the free world, so-called, to, you know, create calm and unity, President Trump chose to weaponize the tensions through his own rhetoric, like labeling protesters as terrorists, like his promise to seize authority from governors who failed to use the most extreme tactics against protesters, and his promise to deploy federal armed forces against protesters in the streets of the US. And this is, of course, an action which would be at best questionable legally. Or the comments he made in which he elevated protecting citizens' rights to bear arms above the rights of African Americans to life and peaceful protest. His words consistently and constantly incited vigilante behavior and violence against Black Americans. President Trump used social media to encourage the use of violence and mass arrests. So that violence escalated all over the country. I don't need to tell you. You know the amount of bloodshed in the streets and the heavy-duty military equipment used by police against demonstrators. And according to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 200 journalists were attacked while they were covering the protest. They were intimidated or arbitrarily arrested, despite the fact that their press credentials were clearly visible. the police arrested more than 11,000 people across the U.S., and at least 62 National Guard soldiers were deployed in 24 cities and states, and curfews were called in ways that just inflamed the situation. All of this has compounded the fact that the U.S. is one of the worst hit in the coronavirus pandemic, and the health officials were continuously telling us that the tear gas would exacerbate, along with the virus, would exacerbate the kinds of problems that the protesters would encounter in terms of respiratory illnesses. This time, it was different because it clearly had to be considered an issue of global human rights, one that had implications for international peace and security, those magic words in the UN. You know, some other magic words and ideas that really sort of propelled my career or the terms decolonization and self-determination. These were ideas that were so powerful that they changed the world order, and they changed the UN as well. You know, Carol Anderson told us, the historian at Emory University, she recounted in her sort of seminal book about the beginnings of the UN and human rights, how, well, you know, the UN Charter was not exactly made for us. And when African American leaders like W.B. Du Bois tried to put the issue of the racial injustice faced by Black Americans on the agenda of the then still fledgling UN, it was quickly dismissed. But within 10 years, the cry for decolonization began to bear fruit. And as the former colonies gained independence, African states got membership in the UN, a seat at the table, and a vote. Those African states then pressed for independence for Namibia and pressed until South Africa became a non-racial democracy. They forced the United Nations to play a critical role in those processes. And they have been pivotal in getting the UN Human Rights Council to act in response to George Floyd's murder. At the same time, the UN's matrix of human rights treaties with the International Convention against the Elimination of Racial Discrimination as playing a role of a centerpiece, began to strengthen the prohibition against racial discrimination, to have some real sort of, it began to have some nuances in it and some sense of what the realities are on the ground. So, that convention and the treaty body, CERT, that it monitors and enforces it, has been doing things like passing general recommendations on the question of the use of criminal justice systems against people of African descent. There is a general recommendation on the question of people of African descent and all of the various ways that they are impacted by racial injustices. And, you know, other treaty bodies have been doing very important work, especially on questions of the right to protest and peaceful assembly. And that's been joined by the system of special rapporteurs that in this case have been very important in speaking out forcefully because of their independence and their right to use their bully pulpit. One of the very important outcomes of the Durban Declaration, Durban Conference Against Racism, which was really important in many ways in the UN in pushing forward the rights of African descendants. But one of the important things that came out of that conference in 2001 was the development of a number of special institutional mechanisms, like the Working Group on People of African Descent, that have played really a critical role in advancing the UN institutional learning and knowledge about anti-Black racism as it manifests itself particularly in the countries of the global North. And so in recent years, I would say that the UN has matured and developed new standards, new institutional bodies, and new actors that could and should play major roles in fighting structural racism. So the cry that Black Lives Matter, which is an undeniable fact, is also a demand, and it is an ultimatum. Time has come for a reckoning, and no institution and no individual can escape that. And so it's shaken the old order as powerfully as those other ideas of decolonization and self-determination, et cetera. So in June, the family of George Floyd, along with the families of other innocent Black people who died in the streets at police hands, particularly Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, and Philando Castile. They, assisted by a broad coalition of over 650 civil society groups from around the world. The ACLU led, and I played my part. And so we brought to the UN the request of the families that the UN Human Rights Council adopt, well, first of all, hold a special session. And they were in session when we brought the letter to them. And the letter demanded a whole special session. We know this is unusual. Yes, it's unusual times. And what we like is for that special session to result in a resolution calling for a commission of inquiry into the murders, the racialized policing, and the systemic racism that has existed in the U.S. since 1619. The brother of George Floyd in the letter stated that, and I quote his words here, Mamie Till Mobley made a decision to open the casket of her son, Emmett Till, so the world could see the atrocities Black people faced in America. He went on to say, I want people across the world and the leaders in the United Nations to see the video of my brother George Floyd, to listen to his cry for help. And I want them to answer his cry. I appeal to the United Nations to help him. The South African government was our principal collaborator inside the UN. And the Africa group, which has grown to a group of 54 member states from Africa, one of the largest blocks in the UN. And so they brought the request to hold this urgent debate during the Human Rights Council. And what we got was unprecedented, not exactly what we asked for, but nevertheless unprecedented. The session was opened by a video appeal from the special rapporteur on racism. I just want to play a bit of it.
The family members of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, and Michael Brown have turned to this body for help. They've joined others in calling for an international commission of inquiry for the situation in the United States. We are aware that some member states have argued that a commission of inquiry should be reserved for more serious human rights violations. We disagree. I repeat, we disagree. If the national and global uprisings we are witnessing are not sufficient evidence of the gravity of the issues before you, it's difficult to imagine what it would take to convince you that the situation we are facing is very serious. It's difficult to imagine what might convince you to demonstrate the equal worth of people of African descent. The decisions this council will take in the context of this urgent debate will undoubtedly find their way into the history books. And we urge you to ensure that those decisions place this body on the right side of history. I thank you for your attention.
Then that was followed by a video appeal from the brother of George Floyd.
The injustice. When people dared to raise their voice and protest for my brother, they were tear gassed, run over with police vehicles. Several people lost eyes and suffered brain damage to rubber bullets. Peaceful protesters were shot and killed by police. Journalists were beaten and blinded when they tried to show the world the brutality happening at the protests. When people raise their voices to protest the treatment of Black people in America, they are silenced. They are shot and killed. My brother George Floyd is one of the many Black men and women that have been murdered by police in recent years. The sad truth is that the case is not unique. The way you saw my brother tortured and murdered on camera is the way Black people are treated by police in America. You watched my brother die. That could have been me. I am my brother's keeper. You in the United Nations are your brothers and sisters keepers in America. And you have the power to help us get justice for my brother George Floyd. I am asking you to help him. I'm asking you to help me. I am asking you to help us, Black people in America. I hope that you will consider establishing an independent commission of inquiry to investigate police killings of Black people in America and the violence used against peaceful protesters.
So, very quickly, we got responses from other corners of the UN. The Secretary General issued a statement saying that we, the UN, we need to raise our voices against all expressions of racism and instances of racist behavior. The High Commissioner on Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, called for the serious action to be taken to halt the killings in the United States. And then also unprecedented, 45 special rapporteurs joined together in a joint letter to the Human Rights Council, which said in part that the uprising nationally is a protest against systematic racism that produces state-sponsored racial violence and licenses impunity for this violence. And finally, the Committee on the Elimination of Racism issued an unusual special statement which said that horrific killings of George Floyd are of grave concern, and they call for accountability for them. Now, the resolution that came out of this was passed on June 10th, and which was very symbolic because Juneteenth, you know, is the June 19th is the date celebrated by Black Americans as a day of emancipation from enslavement. Now, but the resolution we got wasn't quite that, but it was historic in its own ways. It mandated the High Commissioner to call for, let's see, I'm a little bit behind. Yeah, a report for the High Commissioner to do a report, not a commission of inquiry, for the High Commissioner to do a report on systemic racism, on policing practices against African Americans, and violence against protesters. It was, and related incidents around the world, because we did not miss the fact that these kinds of incidents were going on in places like Brazil and even Paris, France, and that it was the responsibility of the council to also respond to those as well. Now, that study is still in progress. It is going to be completed perhaps in March and presented sometime like March. And we hope that it is going to be a thoroughgoing and in-depth examination of structural racism and what it has done in this country in so many ways. Something that at least will approach the comprehensive nature of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. But in the meantime, inside the UN, there's been another revolution going on in the secretariat, in the staff, the global civil service that is sworn to be totally neutral to political events in the outside world. Well, the secretariat has totally lost its cool. They have demanded to join the protest in the streets. That in previous times was a no-no. And even more, the earth-shattering than that is that they are demanding that something be done about the racial discrimination inside the United Nations that has plagued the Secretariat since its beginnings. So now those of you who may not work with the UN on a regular basis may ask, why is this worth the mention? But, if the UN is really going to address the extent to which it is still internally in its core workings an institution of white males from the global north, if that's going to be addressed, really, that means that the UN is going to have to address the racism that exists in practically every country around the globe, because it is the member states that have the lion's share of, if you will, determination of who actually gets on the UN staff. And those who work inside the UN can play, and actually do in many cases, not necessarily to these ends, but can play important roles in setting UN policies and outcomes. And this may open the doors to UN employment to new allies who may share our struggles as their own. Right now, there are few, very, very few, I don't think there are 5, if that many, senior UN Secretariat people, for example, from the Caribbean. There are very few that are people of color that are from the African diaspora, if they're not political appointees that are stuck at the top of the Secretariat. So think of the vastly expanding African diaspora in Europe, in Scandinavia, even in Asia. The hundreds of thousands and millions of Black people who now are resident, many of whom born in those countries, however they got there. It's this is something that, if it truly happens, is another revolution in the UN. And these also may open the doors to other, oppressed minorities around the world who have been kept out of the UN. What goes around comes around in terms of, struggles for equality. Everybody catches the bug. And so there will be new allies, as I say. And so allyship, in my view, has become very important in getting the goals one seeks in the UN either from the governments or the independent experts, so the special rapporteurs, et cetera, in the human rights bureaus in Geneva, or in the Secretariat itself. And they all have played a role, an important role, in this particular struggle. A struggle that, you know, is still being waged, by the way. We haven't gotten the output from our request for the resolution from the High Commissioner yet. But these are ways that, you know, international human rights change by people demanding rights and raising questions and saying, how about me? And these are the processes by which human rights are made and enjoyed. And so this is still in progress. Again, thank you very much for offering me the chance to talk to you about something that we've been very deep in for the last many months. And I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor McDougall, for these very powerful and important remarks. And I know we're all clapping from home again. It's really a wonderful opportunity to be able to learn from you. Professor McDougall has kindly agreed to take some remarks from the audience. I want to point out to take questions from the audience. I want to point out that in the audience, we have individuals who are students, we have faculty members, we have individuals who are members of of Basel, which Dean Weish mentioned before, of Willig and of Millig, these three different interest groups from the American Society of International Law that are supporting this very important event today. And so we want to give people a chance to ask questions. So this is how we propose to proceed. If you could please, you can go to the participants tab and you can raise your hand on the participants tab. That is one way to do it. And I will call on people through the participants tab, and I'll ask you to unmute yourself, very briefly introduce yourself, and to ask your question. Another alternative is to type your question in the chat if you prefer to do that. As the first question, we have a question from President Schmoke, the president of the University of Baltimore, which is, and actually my students also submitted questions and there's some overlap here. He wrote, recently there appears to be an increase in police violence against civilians in Nigeria. Young people have been pictured carrying signs reading "Our Lives Matter." Could Ms. McDougall share her insights into the troubles being experienced in that country? And I want to add to that from one of my students who wrote, do you believe the international community has responded differently to incidences of police brutality in the US as opposed to smaller states, including specifically Nigeria?
Yes. I do think it's responded differently so far. This resolution, by the way, that we put before the Human Rights Council, does speak about the similar violations going on in other countries. So we do expect that there is going to be references to the situation in other countries. As I said, there's Nigeria, there's Kenya, that's exploded as well. Brazil has an astronomical rate of murders of street kids who are basically Afro-Brazilians. So yes, I do think that they've responded differently so far. I think that there is, you just can't overstate the power of the video and the use of technology. So I think that that's been in large part that. But I think that there is an opportunity for all countries that are facing this kind of racist and abusive policing to have their issues heard. You know, Nigeria has not had very many NGOs pushing issues at the UN, and it takes that. Unfortunately, it takes the push. And the fact that you know, we use more technology in the US so far, and B, the civil society is much more organized in certain ways in the US, although, you know, Nigeria has some very well organized, forceful NGOs.
Thank you. Just to clarify, if you do want to raise your hand, you go to the participants tab and click on raise hand, just in case people have questions. I see Ariel Geismar. Could you please, I'm gonna request that you unmute, and then if you could briefly introduce yourself and then ask your question, please. Thank you.
Sure. First, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. This was incredibly insightful. I feel like I learned so much, so thank you so much for being here. My name is Ariel, and I'm a freshman at George Washington University in DC. And I'm curious to know, you talked a lot about allyship. So how can students with privilege going into international affairs be proper allies without taking up too much space and too much opportunities? So how can we really be those strong allies that are important? Thank you.
Well, you know, I think that it's important in whatever space you are, including GW, to, you know, be very purposeful about following the lead, the leadership of, you know, the African descendants. And that is, that's very important, to learn how to listen, to learn how to follow someone else's lead that doesn't have the same privilege that you do, and to offer yourself up in that regard.
Thank you. I'm gonna recognize now Bill Slomanson.
Hi, I'm Bill Slomanson. I teach international human rights at 3 universities here in San Diego. The question I have is that I'm very concerned about, in the next issue of the International Legal Materials of the SIL will appear the US State Department's draft report on human rights. And basically what I'm curious about, because it says, among other things, that each nation should be looking at so-called international human rights through the lens of its own distinctive national traditions, which I think is a scary concept from my perspective. But I'm curious whether we know if the UN, the various entities that you spoke of in your report or in your lecture are going to be looking at that particular, and I hope that they're aware of that particular document. Hopefully they will be when it comes out in the next issue of ILM, and hopefully they will look very closely at some of the interesting details in it, which include looking at the Universal Declaration through the distinctive traditions of each country.
That's interesting. I'm going to run out and get my copy. But I'm sure that there will be people looking at it. I mean, this is probably right in line with this government's, State Department's focus on what they call the religious underpinnings and cultural underpinnings of human rights. You know, not a new concept. You know, we've been fighting back that concept for years and years, and it always loses. There are clearly, you know, values and that have been agreed to as a basis for international human rights norms. I mean, you look at the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is one of the oldest, which has one of the largest number of ratifications, accessions, etc. So it means that there are countries from every kind of legal tradition, every kind of you know, cultural and religious tradition across the world that have agreed that these are the standards with respect to the right to not be discriminated against based on race. So I think that certainly it is, there will be a lot of, as there always are, legal scholars looking at that and writing articles about it and, you know, sort of doing a pushback against it. But thank you for raising that.
I have a question here from a student. It's from your experience working with the South African governmental body in 1994. What similarities, if any, does that election have with today's US presidential election? What advice can you give worried US citizens about the forthcoming election results, and how can law students use their knowledge and future degrees to contribute to the fight against racism?
Well, first of all, in terms of, you know, comparisons to the 1994 elections, I see Professor Henry Richardson's face in the group there, who, yes, who was with me there. There's no comparison. There's no comparison. Look, that election happened after a clear, you know, struggle had been won. And, you know, it was of the greatest sort of sense of fairness that, you know, the ones who had won the victory in the struggle, Black South Africans, said, okay, let's all sit down at the table, let's draw up a new constitution, and let's have an election. It's very different, I think, from this election. And by the way, I hope everybody here is going to vote. No excuses, make a plan, get out there, vote. You know, the situation is just quite different. Now, you know, yes, there are there's a lot of voter suppression activities going on. There was some in 1994, not as extensive, not as organized over quite that long a period of time. But there was voter suppression, of course. So, I don't think that it's particularly useful to try to compare the two. I lost the last part of the question, though.
The last part of the question was, how can law students use our knowledge and future degrees to contribute to the fight against racism?
Look, the fight against racism happens everywhere you are. Certainly in this country, but in others as well. You have got to always be on guard against it. You've got to be the one that always notices who is not in the room, who is not at the table, and to raise those issues and fight against those issues. The fight for racial equality it's a fight for equality of all of us. And, I think that there's no place that I've been where it wasn't going on and was not relevant. So I don't think you have a problem finding venues to find out that. And your knowledge will be, I'm sure, absolutely on target for use in those places and all those venues and struggles, etc.
Thank you. I'm going to call now on my colleague, Tim Sellers, who also had a question he wanted to ask.
Thank you for your very powerful and perceptive remarks just now. I guess I wanted to ask you for a little bit of advice, which was, how do you think that the United Nations or well-intentioned members of the United Nations could most effectively encourage very powerful nations like the United States to respect universal human rights and the rights of racial minorities? What are the tactics or what techniques could be employed to move the United States forward from the United Nations?
Well, look, the United Nations is a very unique animal. What could the UN do? It's hard to say that. As I tried to lay out, there are all these different actors at the UN, and they all got their certain set of rules and strictures. If at this point, and I think it takes the particular to focus in on a particular issue. But I'll tell you at least one or two things. First of all, I think that the UN should end the tradition of taking voluntary contributions from different wealthy countries for funding their little favorite project, like, even human rights or UN Women or whatever, or because what comes with that are high costs in terms of their being able to oppose certain actions that would be taken by those bureaus of all the time. And in fact, they don't even have to march over to oppose it. When we put this resolution, when we got South Africa to put this resolution up before the council. And we had all 54 of the African countries behind it. And they're the majority of the council. So they should be able to give whatever they want, right? The U.S. started lobbying and bullying people in the hallways, telling ambassadors that if you don't pull out of this, or if you don't strike out the words United States and don't mention us and whatever, you're not going to be an ambassador by this time next year. The U.S. State Department spread out to capitals around the world, starting with the poorest of countries, of course, because it's easier to bully them, to threaten their aid packages over the resolution that we were asking the council to consider. And this happens routinely. This got to stop. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has to think through whether or not how she uses her bully pulpit will anger the top donors. Other bureaus that are recipients of big gifts of money from countries, those countries get to say, well, what we'd like for you to do for us is to hire these 5 members of our, foreign ministry to be your top senior people in your secretariat. So, there are no people of color that get to rise to the top ever. And those senior positions began to shape policy decisions from the inside. So, we have to stop that. Whether or not the UN can stop the U.S. from being racist, I wouldn't put it like that. But what the UN can do that would be very important in the struggle against racism in the U.S. is barred from doing by all of these roadblocks. So, it's time for the UN, if the UN is going to go forward in the world and be of relevance, it's got to begin to find ways for its own independence. That's my little speech on what the UN should not. I have a whole list of other things like that, but that's enough for right now.
So I think we have time for one more question, and I have one here from another student, which is so he wrote, do you believe the U.S. lacks authenticity when it espouses international human rights and condemns certain nations for violating them while experiencing similar human rights abuses here at home? Or do you believe the U.S. can express its ideas internationally as long as it progresses internally?
Well, do I think that it lacks authenticity? Yes. And I think that, unfortunately, more and more, the world sees that. I think that, the genie is out of the bottle. And I think one thing that worries those of us who have believed in the UN for so long is, can you put the genie back into the bottle? I don't know. I think that we've got to be very imaginative about how to bring another sort of, how to create another sort of glue to to bind countries and individuals to a commitment to human rights, because the leadership of the United States is badly and sorely sullied.
Okay, we have to end on a higher note than
Okay.
So let me ask you one more question from a student, which I think is a beautiful question in some ways. So she says, she wants to know, she says, you've dedicated so much of your life to working for others, ensuring human rights are not only protected but guaranteed. Did you ever see yourself where you are today? What led you to where you are today? And she also would love to hear what it feels like to impact people's lives for the better using human rights.
Oh, well, no, I never guessed that I would be where I am today, locked in my bedroom. No, I never guessed. And, you know, it was not by a well thought out plan that I wound up here. I followed, you know, I followed my dreams, what I thought I wanted to do and what I really felt passionate about doing. And it just led me from one thing to the next. And I'm very, very lucky. Lucky is the word. To have had such an extraordinarily good time, and one where I have been able to feel that maybe I've done some good.
Well, thank you very much for spending the time with us here today. It's really been an honor and a pleasure to have the opportunity to learn from you. I would like to also thank the Women in International Law Interest Group, Blacks at the American Society of International Law, the Minorities in International Law Interest Group of the American Society for co-sponsoring and supporting this event and being here today. I also want to thank, obviously, our speaker for her amazing remarks and for being here and for taking the time to share with us, and also just the audience in general for coming and being here and hopefully for serving, you know, in some way, some of us can serve as allies to make the world a little better. So thank you, Professor McDougall, and thank you to all of you for being here today. And we got to keep going and keep working on making the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.